about sports and all of that, back in October, I watched this documentary on ESPN Plus, and it was called The Cave of Adullam. Now, that caught my attention. The title of this documentary caught my attention immediately because I knew the Cave of Adullam was a place where David had met with hundreds of men, and we'll get to this moment. It actually happens in the midst of this story today, that he gets to the Cave of Adullam, and it caught my attention because this is David escapes from Saul. When remember he leaves Saul because the Lord is sending him away. This is one of the places he goes to. But this documentary was not about the cave in Israel. It was about the Cave of Adullam in Detroit, Michigan. So that's not quite what I expected, right? But so the full name of this cave is the Cave of Adullam Transformational Training Academy. And in short, it is called Kata, or just the cave. And this gentleman, I think we have a picture of it right here, Jason Wilson, he started the cave in the early 2000s. His nonprofit organization started in 2003, so I don't know if the Cave of Adullam started in 2003 or shortly after that. So we know it started in the early 2000s, and Kata sounds like martial arty, doesn't it? Just the way it is a martial arts training, but it's so much more than a martial arts school. It actually provides what he's called emotional stability training. And according to the Kata website, emotional stability training exposes the root of unresolved anger, anxieties, and lack of focus while teaching our students how to introspectively confront and conquer their negative thoughts before they become toxic actions. That's what the website says. Now, if we would have that last week would have been great, right? Because last week we talked about thoughts, words, actions. And here, this Cave of Adullam Transformational Academy, Training Academy, they think about that very thing, that your thoughts lead to your actions. And so they are trying to make sure that they conquer the negative thoughts before they become toxic actions. They make it clear on their website that this is not like a scared straight approach. They're not trying to scare the students into they're dealing with their issues, but instead they learn how to focus on the soul of each young man that enters the cave. And I think Jason Wilson says it really well. It's like, this is why he started the cave. It's this quote. I have the quote for you. It says, "When I started the cave, I thought black boys needed more discipline. I realized they didn't need more discipline. They needed more love." That was so fitting. Now we started doing this every February with Black History Month, that we focus in on somebody locally, nationally, whatnot, that makes a connection. But we don't do it just because, hey, this is a black person. We do it because it fits within the context of what we're talking about today. We're talking about the Cave of Adullam. And I found out there was a Cave of Adullam. How could I not talk about Jason Wilson and what he's doing? Now, I want to show you. This is so amazing. I love what happened because this has gone on for about 20 years. And what you're about to see is what parents reported has happened to their boys going through the cave. 100% of Kata students who were bullied are no longer victims of bullying. Come on. Well, if you knew martial arts too, I think that would probably help you a little bit, right? That 98% of their sons have grown spiritually since becoming a student in Kata. I mean, the documentary, he does not hide the fact that Jesus is his Lord and Savior, and they talk about Scripture through the whole process with these boys. So you see what parents are saying. And then look at this one. 78% of Kata students have improved their GPA by one letter grade without academic tutoring. It's amazing what happens when you are able to confront and conquer negative thoughts before they become toxic actions. And the last one I will give to you is 50%, and you find all these on their website. 56% of parents reported a decrease in school suspension and an increase in making more positive decisions. This is so perfect to talk about this Cave of Adullam. Sharing it with you today, not just because we're going to talk a little bit about the Cave of Adullam in Israel, but because we just finished our 21 days of prayer and fasting, in the last 7 days, we're all about starting something new in your soul. And this is what he was after. Jason Wilson is all about trying to do something in the souls of these boys. This is what happened, and it is happening to the hundreds of boys. They actually have a waiting list, if I remember hearing right, of over 400 trying to get in to the cave of Adullam. So this has gone through these hundreds, and this is what happened to the hundreds of men who met David in the cave in Israel. Something that happens in our journey through David's life today. So there's a lot we'd have to unpack in 3 chapters. Chapter 21, 22, and 23 of 1 Samuel. There's a lot that we could unpack. And so the way I want us to unpack it is this way. I want us to look at the places that David went. I want us to look at the people David encounters. And I want us to look at the poetry or the Psalms that David writes. David writes quite a lot about these three chapters. There's a lot in the book of Psalms that come from these 3 chapters. These places, people, and poetry all teach us crucial things about understanding David as he was in what was called the wilderness. Now, we've all been in the wilderness, haven't we? And maybe some of us are in the wilderness right now. See, the wilderness represents a time in your life where you're uncertain about your future. And this could be something small, but it could be something big. It's kind of like this. The wilderness is often the place in between. It's the in between what was and what will be. I mean, part of the reality is many of you that are here today that attend a university nearby are in the in-between. But it's not just you who are in that in-between figuring out what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Some of us who are doing what we're doing for the rest of our life aren't necessarily going to do that for the rest of our life. Some of us are already at a certain age. We're thinking, are we going to have kids? Are we going to get married? Are we going to go get a home? Are we going to change our job? Are we going to move to a different place? There's all these things, and often when you're in that place, you're kind of going, I'm not there anymore, but I'm not there. I'm in between. Think about David. David used to be a shepherd. He's going to be the king. But in the wilderness, he's in between. He's in this in-between place, and all of us find ourselves in the in-between at some point, and multiple times. And it's going to be so important for us to learn right now today, what do I do when I'm in the in-between? What do I do when I'm not who I used to be, but I'm not quite yet who I want to be? All that kind of journey that I'm going through, what do I walk through? And David's places, people, and poetry are going to help us so clearly in this matter. See, the places we go matter when we're in the wilderness. The people we encounter matter, and what we write down to remember the wilderness time also matters. So it's important for us to look at places David went, the people David encountered, and the poetry that David wrote during his wilderness time, so we can get better in our own wilderness time. All right, so the first place David went to was a place called Nob. And Nob, if you know, is a place where David encounters some priests. And here he lies to the priests because he's telling them, hey, Saul sent me here on a mission. It's a top secret mission, so don't tell anyone I'm here. So he's lying to them. But I think he might, this is where I take it, and some of the commentaries would agree with this thought, is that he's trying to keep the priests from being responsible for what he's doing. Like they have the ability to deny anything because they don't know really what's going on. And I think that's what David's doing. But the point here is the first place that David went to was God's place. He went to God's place. He went to the priest in Nob. And there's 85 priests that are there at Nob. So he goes to God's place. I think it's so important that you see that he goes to God's place. And when he's at God's place, he is reminded of a few things. And so here we're going to just read a couple of verses from this moment in verse 6 and 9 of 1 Samuel 21. So verse 6 says this. The priest is talking to him. Since there was no other food available, the priest gave him the holy bread, the bread of presence, that was placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. It had just been replaced that day with fresh bread. Every day they would replace with fresh bread of presence. And we really could sit on this for a long time about the bread of presence. But just honestly, just see is what goes with David from God's place is God's presence. That's what you could really take from that. The sense that he gets the bread of presence. But that's not the only thing he gets. Look, verse 9. I only have the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, the priest replied. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Take that if you want it, for there's nothing else here. And David's like, there's nothing like it. Give it to me. Oh, yeah, I need that sword. I don't have a weapon. Saul's hunting me down. Give me Goliath's sword. It is rightfully his to begin with. So here's what we do. So at Nob, at God's place, David receives a weapon that he needs to protect himself. He receives the bread, sustenance, as well as represents God's presence. And so what does he get? He gets a reminder from God that God is going to sustain you. At God's place, you'll get a reminder that God will sustain you. We all, in the time of in-between, when we're in the wilderness, so I don't know what we're going to go, what we're going to do, we got to go to God's place. Now, God's place does not always mean physically a church, but I guarantee you it's so good to come to God's place, the physical building, because it helps you to be reminded that God will sustain you. But you can go to God's place wherever you are in your time alone with God, reading His Bible, praying, connecting with Him deeply, and go to God's place. You can connect with others, whether it be 1, 2, 3, or a dozen, and have a small group. And in that small group, you're in God's place because where 2 or more are gathered, you're there in His midst. And so you could be reminded in a small group that you are in God's place and He will sustain you. This is what David is reminded of, is in God's place, God will provide. God is with him. God will sustain him. We also see at Nob that David encounters a man named Doeg, D-O-E-G. And at the time, we don't know him as an enemy, but we will see it later in these chapters. Even the enemy likes to lurk around places we meet God. Because he wants nothing more than to see us ended before we ever get through our wilderness. So be careful when you leave God's place, your time alone with God, your small group, or here on a Sunday morning, because the enemy likes to lurk nearby. Because what we would like to do more than anything is to take the seed that's been planted in your soil, rip it out, so you never do anything with it. And that's what's so important to know where our heart is, the condition of our heart. Is it hard or is it soft? Because the hard soil, right, the seed is right on top, can be taken right away. And he likes to put rocks in our situation or weeds in our situation, right, so that we don't fully grow and mature. And so we need God to do some gardening of our heart and soul so that we don't have rocks and weeds there. And so when the seed is planted in life, whether it's in our time alone with him or our time together here this morning, that seed goes down deep and the enemy can't ever take it. But that's why he lurks around on a Sunday morning or a Sunday night or midweek, just waiting for the moment to take something from you, even at God's place. Now, that's the first place David goes to. The second place David goes to is Gath, and it's the wrong place. If you don't know what Gath is, Gath was a major Philistine city, like a state city. There's like 5 of them in Philistia. That there's 5 major cities, and Gath is one of the major cities. Gath is where Goliath came from. Now, if we were to read this, we would know that David pretends to be insane to escape the wrong place. But he had to be insane anyways, because what does he go to Gath with? What did he have? Who's that? Goliath's sword. You had to be insane to be carrying on your back the sword of their champion, who you cut the head off. Hey, great reminder. How you guys doing? Check out my sword. That's stupid. We don't always think when we go to the wrong place. We're not always on top of it when we head to the wrong place. What does David do about the wrong place? Well, first let's read about what they thought about David when he came to the wrong place. It says the officers of Achish were unhappy about his being there. I wonder why. They say this, isn't this David the king of the land? Check out the enemies. The Philistines even recognize who David is going to be. Right? So they asked, isn't he the one people honor with dances, singing Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s? Man, it gets around, doesn't it? So David heard these comments, and look what it says. It says that David heard these comments, and he was very afraid. Nope, we got to go to the next one. It's not there. David heard these comments and was very afraid of what King Achish of Gath might do to him. Now, this is actually not in the Bible. Now, see what David wrote about the wrong place. Those are my words, all right? So those got attached on accident. So he actually talks about this encounter in Samuel 21 in 2 Psalms. He takes 2 Psalms to deal with this short little window. It's Psalms 56 and 34. Let me read a few from 56 and 34 for you. Look what it says, verse 3. But when I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. So David's being so honest. Now, I think David is writing after the fact, not like in the midst of this, because he's just glad he got out of there. All right? In the midst of it, he didn't. But after he leaves, he writes Psalm 56, when I'm afraid, I will put my trust in you. Now, many of us know this next verse, verse 8. You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. This tells us that David didn't just have fear. There was an emotional response thinking, oh my goodness, my life could end right now. And he is lamenting, he is weeping. Maybe he was crying after the fact, like, wow, God, you saved me from that. And have you ever had a good moment happen in your life where you cry about that good moment and you're grateful that God got you through that moment, but you're crying about that moment? I don't know what the moment, I just know he's crying. In fact, Mark Batterson, the pastor at National Community Church, he does these things. He'll figure things out. So he figured out how many tears an average person will cry in their lifetime. 10 gallons of tears. And God collects every one. When you're in the wilderness and you're in the wrong place and you're weeping, you're crying, you're in this deep despair kind of place, and your tears are flowing, God's collecting. Please know this, that no matter what you go through, he's with you, and he will sustain you. And those tears that he collects for you, maybe he'll show them to you when you get to heaven. He'll show you each gallon of tears that he has kept for you, because he loves you that much. That's what David connects in the moment where he could have lost his life. And he continues, verse 13, he says this, for you have rescued me from death. You have kept my feet from slipping. So now I can walk in your presence, O God, in your life-giving light. Now, verse 34 is also about him in Gath. And just to be clear, 56 talks about when he was seized in Gath. He's in Gath one other time, but he's not in the Gath that other time. He's not seized. He's actually, he pretends to be on their side. And then Psalm 34 is literally about the time he pretended to be insane. So that's why we believe both of these happen in that moment. Verse 4 of 34, I prayed to the Lord and he answered me. Oh, amen. Come on, right? He freed me from all my fears. He was afraid. Maybe he kept the fear with him when he left the wrong place, but God freed him from his fears. Verse 6 says, in my desperation I prayed, and the Lord listened. He saved me from all my troubles. And verse 18, another verse that many of us have read, prayed, thought about. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. How was David feeling in the midst of the wrong place? He was afraid. He was some place of sorrow, weeping, lamenting, tearful, and his soul is crushed. This is what happens when we go to the wrong place. When we're in the wilderness and we head somewhere we shouldn't be, that happens to us. But the good news is God will sustain you. And if you pray, he will listen and he will rescue. He'll bring you out of the wrong place. And he does that. He brings David out of the wrong place. So we got to be sure to trust God in the process. And just like David, Joseph, while a slave in Egypt, would be in the wrong place when his master's wife tried to seduce him. And he fled, even if it meant he left his cloak behind. And the Bible tells us to flee from sin and temptation, not hang around to see what it will do to us. And even Joseph ends up in prison for the fact that he didn't do anything to his master's wife, but she accused him of it. And so he goes to prison for 2 years, but it was in prison that led him to the palace of Pharaoh, because where Joseph would eventually rule as the governor or the king of Egypt, while Pharaoh was the God king. He ends up where he needs to, even when he's in the wrong place. Just like David. The wrong place brings sorrows and it tears. We can feel crushed and broken. When that happens, we got to find a new place. And that new place for David was the cave of Adullam. And I like to think of this as a resting place. See, after you go to the wrong place, you need to find a resting place. You need to find a place because you're crushed, you're broken, and the cave is no better place to go to find renewal and rest. Hi, Jeff. I'm telling you that I have had the honor for years to have men join me in my office. And Jeff and I have been like, who's next to join us in my office at 6 a.m. on Thursdays? And for us, it's a place of renewal. It's a place of rest. Sometimes it's a place to get our act together. And sometimes it's a place we help others get their act together. And it's much like what David does, because I want to think the cave of Adullam wasn't like some dinky little cave. It's massive. The cave of Adullam was massive. Hundreds of people could be inside this cave. Because we know that the Bible tells us that over 400 men joined David in the cave. Now, I'll get to that in just a second, but we know that that's what happens because there with these men, he trains with these mighty men, their bodies and minds and souls of what was ahead. We need to find these places of escape from all that life assaults us with. These are the places of rest and renewal, places where we can come together with others and we can come out better than we entered. Let me show you it in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 22. So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers and all his other relatives joined him there. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt or who were discontented, until David was the captain of about 400 men. Notice this, these men who were coming, they were in trouble, they were in debt, they were discontented. The trouble even says that they were distressed. So one translation's got a perfect one for a pastor, 3 Ds, distressed, debt, and discontented. So New Living Translation's like, forget that. But anyways, the whole point is these men are come. Was David distressed? What was David in debt? I don't know about that. He didn't have to pay taxes, right? But we don't. He's definitely in trouble. He definitely understands. He's probably discontented right now because I'm supposed to rule someday, and I'm hiding in a cave. So he knows what these men are going through. They know what he's going through. And because they know what each other's going through, they can go through this together and become better than what they were. In fact, these men were, just like I said, like David. They were dealing with similar issues David was dealing with. Maybe not identical, but similar. And together as brothers of the cave, I think they were like those from Jason Wilson's Kata in Detroit. They would be transformed. And no longer would they be bullied by the enemy or their wilderness. And if you want to get a glimpse of what some of these 400 men, and eventually become 600 men, these hundreds of men, go read 2 Samuel 23, verses 18 through 39. You'll get a glimpse of a few of these guys. These guys were studs. These guys took on enemies in ways you could never imagine. But I don't think they could when they came to the cave at first. They needed to find rest. They needed to find renewal. Every one of you needs to find a place that is a resting place. See, Jesus even found a resting place in a boat that was sinking. A boat that was filling up with water. It was in my time alone with God today. My time alone with God was that story where Jesus is asleep as the boat is taking in water. That says to me, Jesus is getting wet, and he's still sleeping. Dude was tired. He rested. And the Bible tells us they're in real danger. And he gets up and he calms the wind and says to them, "Where's your faith?" And then there's so much story to that because he goes, we can't get into it. I'll get too distracted into that story. But the whole point is we all need a resting place. Jesus would go away to a solitary place where he would pray. He went to resting places. We all need it. Here's what David wrote about his time in the cave. Psalm 57. Have mercy on me, O God, have mercy. I look to you for protection. I will hide beneath the shadow of your wings until the danger passes by. And then verse 6 and 7, the same chapter, my enemies have set a trap for me. I am weary from distress. They have dug a deep pit in my path, but they themselves have fallen into it. My heart is confident in you. How did he change? My heart is confident in you, O God. My heart is confident. He said it twice. He's making sure everyone who ever reads this understands. I don't even know he knows people are ever going to read this. I don't know, 2,900 years ago when David writes, my heart is confident, oh God, my heart is confident. He was thinking that guy named David Grieve who's going to preach that message. He's going to tell everyone about it. He's not thinking that. He's just writing down what he's remembering of what he's going through. He didn't think it was going to be in the Bible. He didn't even know that there was no Bible. There was the Torah, but you know what I'm saying? He was just writing down the things that he remembers, what he's going through. And what does he say? My heart is confident in you, God. If you've never written that down, then you're missing out on remembering what God does in your life. Because God's God wants every one of us, online or in person, to be able to say, my heart is confident in you, God. So David does that. My heart is confident. No wonder I can sing your praises. David felt protected in the cave. That's what he talks about there in the verse, based on those verses. David found renewal in the cave. But he also knew that the cave wasn't the right place for his parents. And so he goes to a different place. I called it, later on I realized I should have called it a safe place. But a different place. He goes to the king of Moab. Let's read that real quick. He goes to a different place, takes his parents here, and let's read this. It's 1 Samuel 22, 3 and 4. Later David went to Mizpah in Moab, where he asked the king, please allow my father and mother to live here with you until I know what God is going to do for me. So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during the entire time David was living in his stronghold. We don't know exactly how long this is, but this is a long time. The question is, why does David take his parents to Moab? Why not somewhere else? Why not hide in Judah? Why not go here or there? He goes to Moab. You got to think about this a little bit. David's great-grandma is Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. Ruth left Moab with her mother-in-law Naomi when their husbands all died. Because Naomi and her husband and sons came to Moab when there was, I believe, a famine in the land of Israel. And they stayed there until their husbands died. And only Ruth went back to with Naomi to Israel. And there, Ruth finds and meets and marries David's great-grandpa, Boaz. So why does David take his parents to Moab? His family. They're relatives. What you don't always realize when you're in the wilderness is that even when you're not in the wilderness, God's preparing to take care of you in your wilderness. God was preparing for David to send his mom and dad to Moab when David wasn't even alive. Because he said, Ruth, go with your mother-in-law, Naomi, to Israel. And what does Ruth say? Your God will become my God. And because Ruth steps out in faith and goes with her mother-in-law and then steps out in faith with Boaz and all that happens there, the kinsman redeemer, which also shows us Jesus and all this beautiful stuff that happens in the book of Ruth, all of that, long before David is alive, God is preparing for David and his parents when they would be in the wilderness. God is preparing for your wilderness time even before you're alive. He knows you're going to go through what you're going through. He's already preparing the things you need for you to go through them. He will provide the safe places, the different places that wouldn't necessarily come to your mind in the moment unless you're in that place of the wilderness. What was the reminder? God will sustain you in the wilderness. Now, the fifth place we're not going to talk about in person today. It's going to be my deeper dive. I didn't do a deeper dive last week, but this week we're going to do a deeper dive. And the fifth place, just to let you know, is called Judah. David goes back to Judah for some time, and I really pretty much call that place the dark place. What we're going to see in that dark place is that David does some protecting of others, even in the dark place. So even when you're in a dark place, you still need to be thinking about others when you're in the dark place. But I don't have time to go into that today, and so we're going to skip that and move on to the last place David goes to. And the last place David goes to is En Gedi. Now, 1 Samuel 23:29 simply tells us, David then went to live in the strongholds of En Gedi. So he goes from Judah, where he's basically hiding from Saul and almost gets caught by Saul, but then Saul gets taken away. Again, so much we'll talk about in the deeper dive later on this week. So David then goes to En Gedi, and I call En Gedi the perfect place. But he didn't start in the perfect place, did he? He was in God's place. Then he was in the wrong place. And then he was in a resting place. And then he took care of his parents and put them in a different or safe place. And there's even a dark place. But after the dark place, we can find the perfect place. Here's what you need to know about En Gedi. I just did not have time to be able to put the videos or pictures up for you because I've had the crazy privilege of being at En Gedi. And En Gedi is like an oasis of sorts in the desert. It is really close to the Dead Sea, so it makes no sense that near the Dead Sea you would find a place with streams of fresh water and green all over the place in the desert. And creatures that as a tourist you don't want to see, but as David, because we read about it, and there's these different animals that would live in En-Gedi. And so David would go to En-Gedi, and there he would have fresh water, he would have food. He would have everything that he needs in the midst of the wilderness. And he would live in a cave like the cave of Adullam. And at the end of this path that you take in En-Gedi, you get to what's called David's waterfall, because there is a waterfall. At the time, it wasn't flowing incredibly fast or anything, but again, 2,900 years, who knows how much it was. And past the water, again, just a little bit of water when we were there, but past the waterfall is a cave. And you know that the cave goes in. So David lived in a cave next to a waterfall with fresh water and animals around, green around him, and no one would ever have thought this is where David's going to hide for the long term. It's a perfect place. We can get to the perfect place even in the midst of our wilderness. Just as the first place was a reminder that God was with David and would provide for David and sustain him, the last place, this perfect place, was the realization of that reminder. It was at En-Gedi where David was provided for, and God changed David as he sustained him during the wilderness journey. And Psalm 63, David writes about his wilderness journey, and to me, I feel like he's writing about it in Psalm 63 in two ways. One, life before En-Gedi. Look at verse 1. O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. And then he writes about the life in the wilderness after En-Gedi. Verse 4 and 5, I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up my hands to you in prayer. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. I will praise you with songs of joy. See, in David's wilderness time, no matter the place that David was at, or the people David was with, or the poetry David wrote, God sustained him. And no matter where you find yourself at or find yourself with, if you write it all down, you too will see that God sustained you. That's the most important thing to learn about the wilderness, about the in-between. So I ask the worship team to come up. We're going to sing a song. I have an altar response here in just a moment. But I want to give you a challenge today. And this challenge is really, really basic. But I would say really important. Start a journal. Start a journal and write down how you see God has sustained you and is sustaining you. I have so many journals that I have written in with I have two different journals right now. I have one that I write in for my SOAP time, my study, observation, application, prayer, my time alone with God. And I just write about the verses that I've read that I highlighted, and then how I see those verses and how they apply to me, and then I just write a little prayer. And then I have another journal that I am journaling my journey, my life journey, and the things that mattered to me, or that just kind of stepped, just whoa, I need to write that one down. And I purposely got a journal that's like really cool. I got it at Pike Place Market when we were in Seattle, and it's got this leather, and you wrap around with a string. It's like this, because I wanted to write in something like that felt manly. It's me, and that's what I needed. I don't know, it's just like, oh, this feels like something David would have had and would have been writing in. That's me. I'm not saying you have to worry about how you write and what you write, but it's like, yeah, this is what I would want to write in. And way back when, somewhere around 9 years ago, I wrote my book, Son of David, and some of the men in here are going through it. But most of the stories that I have in Son of David about me have been written in a journal that I wrote, and I just had to remember, and I had to grab them and bring them and put them into that book. And one day, in not too far distant future, I'll start writing some of the other books that God has in my mind, and I know where a lot of my stories are going to come from. It's going to come from the journal I'm using right now, the journals that I've used. I'm just telling you, maybe I'm speaking to guys more than ladies in this moment, because somehow we think it's like feminine to write stuff down. That's just so not true. I don't know if that's what a guy thinks here or not, but I'm telling you right now, to be able to read what I have gone through. When I went on sabbatical, I wrote every single day, and I can go back to reading what God did for me for those 90 days I was gone. I've written about the things that happened in Israel. I can go back to those times when God showed up in these weird, crazy ways in Israel, and the memories that were there. The times that we've gone on trips together, and there's things that I'm journaling now that I can't wait to look back on later. And so I'm just telling you, start a journal. Start writing your stories down, and you will be like David. Your stories may never get into a book like the Bible, the best-selling book ever on the face of the planet, but they may speak to your ancestors one day, or descendants, sorry. There's like that verse that your descendants, maybe your grandkids will pick up a journal that you wrote, and they'll read about what happened in your life on February 6th, 2023. And God will speak to them what they read about what you know. Man, I know it's a simple challenge, but I believe it will have lasting effect on you and generations to come. Points here today that I want to walk us through. These will be our altered response here this morning, that you can come forward and be prayed for. Go ahead and put those prayer points up for me, Corbin. And so it could be this, but you can pray. We'll pray with you for anything. During the midst of this song, we'll pray with you about anything. And then I'll be hanging out over by Cafe Roma's seating area with the donuts. You can come say hi to me there. I'd love to meet you, say hi to you. Some of you I'll need to learn your name for the first time or for the 16th time. Just wait. So, but here it is. You're here and say, I need Jesus. You know, last Sunday night we had a teenager give her life to Jesus. Come on. So excited for her. And so she's going to get baptized here pretty soon. And but she answered to that prayer point on last Sunday night. And so maybe you're here and say, I need Jesus. Come up and we'll pray with you. Or maybe this is you. You're in the wilderness right now and you just need rest. Maybe you're here and you need to write down what you're going through. And maybe you're here and you need to care for others. The idea of care for others is that David, even in his wilderness, cared for his parents. Sometimes we think we don't have time. We got to make the time to care for others, even in our wilderness. And the area we didn't talk about, the dark place, David protected cities in Judah, even while he was on the run from Saul. He took care of others. We need to take care of others. So maybe this is you. I need to care for others. I need to write it down. I need rest, or I need Jesus. Give you a chance very simply. If that's you, I want you to respond by coming forward today as the song is being played, and leaders from New Life will come up and pray with you. If it's one of those things, we want to pray with you here today. So let's do that. God, I pray right now for those that are here that say, I need Jesus, I need rest, I need to write my stories down of how you sustain me, or I need to be like David and I need to care for those who are around me, even as I'm going through the wilderness. God, I pray that would be what happens here today. People would respond to that today in the midst of this song, and we would sing to you our cornerstone. And we pray. Amen. Amen. You can come forward for us to pray with you.